The clink of ice against crystal echoed through the dimly lit room as Thaddeus Hawthorne leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Around him, the Seabrook Yacht Club buzzed with the low hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter, but Thaddeus wasn't listening. His focus was on the men seated across from him, three wealthy acquaintances who were more parasites than friends. "You're bluffing," said Victor Langley, swirling his bourbon with a smug grin. "No way you'd actually do it." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow, his voice smooth but laced with venom. "Do what? Marry someone I don't give a damn about? Please. That's half the marriages in this room." He gestured vaguely to the other patrons, his tone dripping with disdain. Victor chuckled, leaning forward. "Not just anyone, though. You said the oldest, sickest woman you could find. That's not exactly your usual type, Hawthorne." The table erupted into laughter, but Thaddeus didn't flinch. Instead, he drained the last of his drink and set the glass down with deliberate force. "Watch me," he said, his voice cold enough to silence the group. "I'll prove how meaningless marriage is. Hell, I'll make it a spectacle." The challenge hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Victor exchanged glances with the others before shrugging. "Fine. Name your terms." Thaddeus leaned in, his sharp eyes gleaming with something dangerous. 6 months. If I can convince her to marry me and stay married for that long, you owe me 50 grand each. If I fail," he paused, letting the weight of the moment settle, "I'll donate $1 million to charity. And I won't complain about it." The men stared at him, stunned by the audacity of the bet. Finally, Victor extended his hand. "Deal." As the agreement was sealed with a handshake, Thaddeus felt a flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't about the money. It never was. This was about proving a point, about showing the world just how hollow relationships had become. But as he left the club that night, one name lingered in his mind: Edith Meriwether. She was old, frail, and known for her kindness, a perfect pawn in his game. Little did he know, she would change everything. Edith Meriwether sat at the small desk in the corner of Seabrook Public Library, her hands steady as she flipped through a stack of returned books. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. She didn't notice the whispers that occasionally drifted her way from the patrons. Comments about her age, her frailty, or the cane she now relied on to move around. Edith had spent decades learning how to tune out the noise. Her granddaughter, Willow, often told her to slow down, to take it easy. But Edith couldn't imagine sitting idle while there was still work to be done. The library wasn't just a building filled with books. It was a sanctuary for the people of Seabrook, and she intended to keep it that way for as long as she could. Today, however, her thoughts kept drifting back to the rumors she'd overheard earlier in the week. Something about Thaddeus Hawthorne and a bet. She hadn't paid much attention at first. Gossip was as common in Seabrook as the salt in the air. But the name stuck with her. Thaddeus Hawthorne wasn't someone you forgot easily. He was a man who carried himself like he owned the town, even though he rarely stepped foot outside his mansion on the cliffs. Edith shook her head, dismissing the thought. Whatever foolishness Thaddeus was up to, it didn't concern her. Or so she told herself. The sound of footsteps interrupted her reverie. A young boy, no older than 10, approached the desk, clutching a tattered copy of Treasure Island. His cheeks were flushed, and he looked nervous, as if he expected to be scolded for damaging the book. "Is this okay?" he asked hesitantly, holding it out. Edith smiled warmly, taking the book from him. "It's perfect," she said, running her fingers over the worn cover. "Books are meant to be loved, not kept pristine. This one has clearly been on quite the adventure." The boy's face lit up, and he thanked her before hurrying off. Watching him go, Edith felt a familiar pang of satisfaction. Moments like these reminded her why she dedicated her life to the library. It wasn't about the books themselves. It was about the stories they carried and the lives they touched. As the evening wore on, the library began to empty. Edith gathered her things, preparing to head home. Just as she was locking the front door, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Her heart sank when she saw who stepped out. Thaddeus Hawthorne. He strode toward her with the confidence of a man who always got what he wanted. dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. He looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the modest library. Edith tightened her grip on her cane, steeling herself. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "I need to speak with you." Edith raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "If you're here to ask for a donation, Mr. Hawthorne, I'm afraid you've wasted your time. The library operates on a shoestring budget as it is." Thaddeus chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "No, nothing like that. May we go inside?" She hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, but make it quick." Once inside, Thaddeus wasted no time getting to the point. He explained his proposition, a temporary marriage in exchange for financial support for Willow. Edith listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she leaned heavily on her cane, studying him with sharp eyes. "You think very little of people, don't you?" she said finally. Thaddeus shrugged. "I think realistically. You get something out of this too. Isn't that what matters?" Edith considered him for a long moment, weighing her options. She knew Thaddeus's reputation. All of Seabrook did. But she also knew Willow's struggles. Her granddaughter had dreams of becoming an artist, but the cost of tuition in New York was crushing her spirit. If this arrangement could ease some of that burden, all right, Edith said at last. But under one condition. Thaddeus arched an eyebrow. "And what's that?" "For the next 6 months, you'll learn something valuable about yourself. Not because I care whether you win your little bet, but because I believe everyone deserves a chance to grow, even someone like you." Thaddeus stared at her, momentarily caught off guard. Then he nodded, a sly smile creeping onto his face. "Deal." The next morning, Thaddeus stood in the grand foyer of his cliffside mansion, staring at the suitcase Edith had brought with her. It was small, unassuming, and somehow managed to look out of place among the opulence surrounding it. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of irritation, not because of the bag itself, but because of what it represented. This entire arrangement felt absurd, even by his standards. Edith entered the room moments later, her cane clicking softly against the marble floor. She took in the sweeping staircase, the crystal chandelier, and the oversized oil paintings lining the walls without so much as raising an eyebrow. If she was impressed, or intimidated, by the display of wealth, she didn't show it. "You'll be staying in the East Wing," Thaddeus said curtly, gesturing toward a corridor. "Your room has its own sitting area and bathroom. I assume that's sufficient?" "It's more than sufficient," Edith replied, her tone calm but firm. "Though I hope you don't expect me to spend all my time hiding away in there." Thaddeus frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, meeting his gaze, "that if we're going to pull this off convincingly, we'll need to act like an actual married couple. That means meals together, conversations, maybe even the occasional outing. People will notice if we're completely indifferent to each other." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. She had a point. The last thing he needed was for someone to suspect this marriage was anything less than genuine. Still, the idea of spending time with her grated on him. He'd agreed to this arrangement out of boredom and arrogance, not because he wanted company. "Fine," he said after a pause. "But don't expect me to entertain you." Edith smiled faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Don't worry, Mr. Hawthorne. I'm not here for entertainment." Over the next few days, an uneasy rhythm began to form between them. Breakfast was served promptly at 8, though Thaddeus often lingered over his coffee while Edith read the newspaper. Dinners were quieter affairs, eaten in the formal dining room under the watchful eyes of portraits from generations past. At first, their conversations were stilted and awkward, filled with polite inquiries about the weather or local news. But gradually, Edith started steering the discussions toward topics that made Thaddeus uncomfortable: his family, his childhood, the choices that had led him to this point in his life. One evening, as they sat in the library, a room Thaddeus rarely used, Edith asked, "Why do you hate people so much?" Thaddeus looked up from the book he wasn't really reading, startled by the bluntness of the question. "I don't hate people," he said defensively. "I just don't trust them." "And why is that?" she pressed, setting aside her knitting needles. He hesitated, caught off guard by her persistence. No one had ever dared to ask him such a direct question before. Let's just say I've been burned enough times to know better. Edith nodded slowly, as if considering his answer. Pain can make us cynical, yes, but it can also teach us empathy. If we let it. Thaddeus snorted. Empathy doesn't pay the bills. No, she agreed. But it enriches the soul. Something tells me yours could use some enrichment. Her words lingered in the air long after she excused herself for the night. Thaddeus sat there for a while, staring into the fire, wondering why they bothered him so much. Meanwhile, Willow Merriweather arrived in Seabrook 2 weeks later, her arms laden with sketchbooks and half-finished canvases. She hadn't planned to visit, not with her looming deadlines and mounting student loans. But when Edith called to explain the situation, she couldn't refuse. Besides, seeing her grandmother happy was worth any inconvenience. Willow's first impression of Thaddeus was less than favorable. He greeted her with a perfunctory nod and disappeared into his office without so much as offering her a tour of the house. Edith apologized profusely, but Willow waved it off. "It's fine," she said with a shrug. "I didn't come here for him anyway." Still, living under the same roof as Thaddeus proved challenging. He kept to himself most of the time, emerging only for meals or brief appearances in the garden. When he did interact with Willow, it was usually to criticize something. The noise from her music, the mess in the studio Edith had set up for her, or the way she slouched in her chair. Each comment grated on her nerves, but she refused to rise to the bait. One afternoon, while working on a new painting, Willow heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Thaddeus standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "What are you working on?" he asked, surprising her. She hesitated, unsure whether to answer honestly. Finally, she gestured to the canvas. "It's abstract, kind of experimental." Thaddeus stepped closer, studying the swirls of color and texture. "It's chaotic," he said after a moment. Willow bristled. "That's the point." To her surprise, he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. You're trying to capture emotion, aren't you?" She blinked, caught off guard by his insight. "Yeah, I guess I am." They stood there in silence for a moment, the tension between them easing slightly. Then Thaddeus cleared his throat and turned to leave. "Keep at it," he said over his shoulder. "You might actually be onto something." Willow watched him go, confused but oddly encouraged. For the first time since arriving, she wondered if there was more to Thaddeus Hawthorne than met the eye. The days grew shorter as autumn settled over Seabrook, painting the town in shades of amber and gold. Thaddeus found himself spending more time in the library, not because he enjoyed reading, but because Edith seemed to gravitate toward it. She had a way of making even the most mundane spaces feel alive, her presence filling the room with quiet energy. He told himself he was merely observing her habits, trying to understand how she managed to command respect without saying a word. But deep down, he knew there was something else drawing him to her company. One rainy afternoon, Edith sat by the window, flipping through an old photo album. Thaddeus lingered in the doorway, debating whether to interrupt. When she noticed him, she gestured for him to sit across from her. "These are pictures from when I first moved to Seabrook," she explained, sliding the album toward him. "It wasn't much back then, just a fishing village with big dreams." Thaddeus glanced at the faded photographs, surprised by how different the town looked. In one image, a group of men stood in front of what would eventually become the Hawthorne estate. Among them was a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to his grandfather. "That's your family, isn't it?" Edith asked softly, following his gaze. "Yes," Thaddeus admitted, his voice tinged with unease. "But I don't remember seeing these before." Edith nodded, her expression unreadable. "Your grandfather was instrumental in building this town. He invested heavily in its development, though not always for altruistic reasons." Thaddeus frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "Let's just say not everyone benefited equally from his generosity. Some families thrived, while others didn't." Her tone implied more than she said outright, and Thaddeus felt a flicker of curiosity. For years, he'd avoided thinking about his family's legacy, dismissing it as irrelevant to his own life. But now, Sitting here with Edith, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Later that week, Thaddeus decided to visit the Seabrook Historical Society, a small museum tucked away on the edge of town. The curator, an elderly man named Harold Pierce, greeted him warmly but seemed puzzled by his interest in local history. "I'm researching my family's contributions to the town," Thaddeus explained, skimming through dusty ledgers and yellowed documents. Harold nodded knowingly. "Ah, yes. The Hawthorns played a significant role in shaping Seabrook. Though some might argue their methods weren't entirely above board." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" "Well," Harold began, adjusting his glasses, "there were rumors about land acquisitions, claims that certain properties were obtained under questionable circumstances. And then there's the matter of the Meriwether family." At the mention of the name, Thaddeus stiffened. "What about them?" Harold hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "It's probably nothing, just old gossip. But some say your grandfather wronged the Meriwethers decades ago. A business deal gone sour. Or perhaps something more personal. No one really knows for sure." Thaddeus left the museum with more questions than answers. The connection between his family and Edith's gnawed at him, refusing to let go. That night, he confronted her in the library. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. Edith looked up from her book, unfazed. "Tell you what? About my grandfather. About the Meriwethers." For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze steady and unflinching. Then she closed her book and set it aside. "Because it doesn't matter anymore." "It matters to me," Thaddeus shot back. "If there's something I need to know, I deserve to hear it." Edith sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Very well. But don't expect apologies or explanations. What happened between our families is ancient history." She went on to recount the story, a tale of betrayal, abandonment, and heartbreak. Decades earlier, Edith's mother had been involved with Thaddeus's grandfather, only to be cast aside when she became pregnant. The child, Edith herself, was raised in poverty, while the Hawthorns prospered. It was a wound that had never fully healed, though Edith had long since chosen forgiveness over bitterness. When she finished speaking, the room fell silent. Thaddeus struggled to process what he'd heard, anger and guilt warring within him. "Why didn't you use this against us? You could have ruined my family." Edith smiled sadly. "Revenge doesn't bring peace, Mr. Hawthorne. All it does is perpetuate pain. I chose a different path, one of grace and resilience." Her words struck a chord deep inside him, though he wasn't ready to admit it. Instead, he muttered a curt thank you and retreated to his study, where he spent the rest of the night staring out at the stormy sea. Meanwhile, Willow continued to explore her creativity in the makeshift studio Edith had arranged for her. Her paintings grew bolder, each canvas a reflection of her inner turmoil and hopes. One evening, as she worked late into the night, she heard soft footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Edith standing in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl. "You're still awake?" Edith observed gently. Willow shrugged, setting down her brush. "I couldn't sleep. This place inspires me." Edith stepped closer, studying the painting on the easel. It depicted a lone figure standing on a cliff, silhouetted against a turbulent sky. "That's beautiful," she said after a moment. "Is it supposed to represent anyone in particular?" Willow hesitated, then shook her head. "Not really. Just someone searching for meaning, I guess." Edith nodded thoughtfully. "We all are, in our own ways." They talked for a while longer, sharing stories and laughter until the early hours of the morning. By the time they parted ways, Willow felt lighter, as if a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. The revelation about his family's past weighed heavily on Thaddeus in the days that followed. He found himself replaying Edith's words over and over, searching for some way to reconcile what he'd learned with the man he thought he was. For years, he had prided himself on being self-made, untethered from the sins of his ancestors. But now, those sins felt uncomfortably close, like shadows stretching across generations. He tried to avoid Edith after their conversation, retreating into his work and burying himself in meetings and phone calls. Yet no matter how busy he kept himself, her calm acceptance haunted him. She hadn't demanded justice or retribution. Instead, she had offered understanding, a grace he didn't feel he deserved. One evening, as he sat alone in his study nursing a glass of whiskey, there was a soft knock at the door. Before he could respond, Willow entered, carrying a sketchpad under one arm. "Am I interrupting?" she asked cautiously. Thaddeus shook his head, gesturing for her to sit. "Not particularly." Willow hesitated before lowering herself into the chair across from him. "I just wanted to say thank you for letting me use the studio and for helping Grandma." Thaddeus waved a dismissive hand. "It's nothing. Your grandmother made the agreement, not me." "But still," Willow persisted, her voice firm despite her nervousness. "You didn't have to agree to any of this. You could have walked away." He glanced at her sharply, surprised by her perceptiveness. Most people assumed his actions were driven by selfishness or indifference, but Willow seemed to see something else beneath the surface. It unnerved him. "I have my reasons," he said finally, his tone clipped. Willow studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. But if you're going to stick around, maybe try not to be such a jerk about it." Her bluntness caught him off guard, and for the first time in weeks, he laughed, a low, gruff sound that startled even him. Willow grinned triumphantly, as if scoring a small victory. The next morning, Edith suggested they visit the local farmers market together. Thaddeus initially resisted, claiming he had too much work to do, but she insisted. "People will start asking questions if we never leave the house," she reminded him. Reluctantly, he agreed. The market was bustling with activity, vendors calling out to passers-by and children darting between stalls. Edith moved slowly, stopping frequently to chat with acquaintances or admire handmade crafts. Thaddeus trailed behind her, feeling out of place among the cheerful crowd. At one stall, an elderly woman selling jams and preserves recognized Edith and greeted her warmly. "And who's this handsome gentleman with you today?" she asked, eyeing Thaddeus curiously. "This is my husband, Thaddeus," Edith replied without missing a beat. The woman's eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly recovered, offering her congratulations. As they continued through the market, Thaddeus noticed the subtle changes in how people treated them. Strangers smiled more readily, shopkeepers went out of their way to assist them, and even children seemed less intimidated by his presence. It was disorienting but strangely comforting, like stepping into a world where he wasn't constantly judged or resented. By the time they returned home, Thaddeus felt oddly lighter, as if some invisible weight had been lifted. Edith noticed the shift in his demeanor and smiled knowingly. "See? Not so bad, was it?" He shrugged, unwilling to admit she might be right. "It's fine, but don't expect me to make a habit of it." Later that week, Willow decided to host an impromptu art show in the garden, inviting a few friends from town to view her latest pieces. Thaddeus initially declined to attend, citing prior engagements, but Edith convinced him to make an appearance. "For appearance's sake," she added pointedly. The event turned out to be more enjoyable than Thaddeus anticipated. Willow's paintings were displayed on easels scattered throughout the garden, each piece accompanied by a brief description written in her looping handwriting. Guests mingled freely, sipping lemonade and discussing the artwork with genuine enthusiasm. Thaddeus found himself drawn to a painting near the back of the garden. It depicted two figures standing side by side, one tall and imposing, the other slight and frail, against a backdrop of stormy skies. The resemblance to him and Edith was unmistakable. "That one's called Unlikely Partners," Willow said, appearing beside him. "It's about finding strength in unexpected places." Thaddeus stared at the painting, struck by its simplicity and depth. "It's good," he admitted grudgingly. Willow beamed, clearly pleased by his reaction. "Thanks. I think it's one of my best yet." As the evening wore on, Thaddeus found himself engaging in conversations with Willow's friends, answering questions about his business ventures and sharing anecdotes about Seabrook's history. For the first time in years, he felt like part of a community rather than an outsider looking in. When the guests finally departed, leaving behind empty glasses and scattered flower petals, Willow approached Thaddeus with a mischievous grin. "So, did I change your mind about art shows?" He raised an eyebrow, feigning indifference. Don't push your luck. But as he watched her laugh and hug Edith goodbye, he couldn't help feeling a flicker of pride. Maybe, just maybe, this arrangement wasn't as meaningless as he'd once believed. The air grew colder as November settled over Seabrook, bringing with it a biting wind that rattled the windows of the Hawthorne mansion. Thaddeus found himself spending more time in the attic, a place he had avoided for years. It was cluttered with relics from his family's history, old furniture, dusty trunks, and boxes filled with papers yellowed by time. He told himself he was merely curious, but deep down, he knew he was searching for answers. One afternoon, while sifting through a stack of documents, he stumbled upon a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting on the envelopes was unfamiliar, yet something about it tugged at his memory. He opened the first letter carefully, his eyes scanning the words. "My dearest Henry, I write to you with both joy and sorrow in my heart. Our child grows within me, a miracle we created together, yet I fear your silence means you have turned away from us." Thaddeus froze, his breath catching in his throat. The name Henry belonged to his grandfather, a man he had always viewed as stern and unyielding, not someone capable of such intimate correspondence. As he read further, the truth became undeniable. These were love letters written by Edith's mother to his grandfather, chronicling their affair and its tragic aftermath. Each letter revealed more about the woman who had been cast aside, the dreams she had harbored, the struggles she endured, and the quiet strength she passed down to her daughter. By the time Thaddeus reached the final page, his hands trembled with a mixture of anger and shame. His family had caused this pain, and now he was living under the same roof as the woman who had borne its weight. That evening, Thaddeus confronted Edith in the library. She sat by the fire, knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a scarf. When he entered, holding the bundle of letters, her expression shifted from calm to wary. "You knew," he accused, his voice low but charged with emotion. "You knew all along." Edith set her knitting aside, meeting his gaze steadily. "Yes, but knowing isn't the same as dwelling, Mr. Hawthorne. What would you have done differently if I told you sooner?" Thaddeus clenched his fists, struggling to articulate the storm of feelings inside him. "I don't know. Something. Anything," she sighed, her tone softening. "The past can't be changed, no matter how much we wish otherwise. What matters is what we do now. With the knowledge we have and the choices before us." Her words struck a chord, though he resisted letting them sink in. Instead, he demanded, "Why didn't you hate us? After everything?" Edith smiled faintly, a trace of sadness in her eyes. "Hate is exhausting, Thaddeus. It consumes you until there's nothing left. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing peace over bitterness. I made that choice long ago." Thaddeus sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the weight of her response. For the first time, he began to see Edith not just as a kind old woman, but as someone who had faced unimaginable hardship and emerged stronger for it. Her resilience unsettled him, forcing him to confront his own weaknesses. Meanwhile, Willow continued to immerse herself in her art, using it as a way to process the complexities of her new life. One day, while sketching in the garden, she noticed Thaddeus pacing near the cliffs. His movements were restless, his face clouded with thought. Intrigued, she approached cautiously. "Everything okay?" she asked, keeping her distance. He glanced at her, startled, then shook his head. "Not really, but I doubt you want to hear about it." Willow shrugged, sitting cross-legged on the grass. "Try me. You might be surprised." After a moment's hesitation, Thaddeus recounted what he had discovered in the attic. The letters, the betrayal, the lingering guilt. To his surprise, Willow listened without judgment, nodding occasionally as if piecing together a puzzle. "That must have been tough to read," she said when he finished. "But maybe it's a chance to make things right. Not for them, but for yourself." "What do you mean?" he asked, frowning. "I mean, you can't change the past, but you can decide how it shapes you. Maybe helping Grandma wasn't just about money or appearances. It was about breaking the cycle, starting fresh." Her insight caught him off guard, and for the first time, he considered the possibility that she might be right. Perhaps this arrangement wasn't just a farce. Perhaps it was an opportunity to rewrite his family's legacy. Later that week, Thaddeus accompanied Edith to a charity event hosted by the Seabrook Historical Society. The venue was decorated with vintage photographs and artifacts, including several pieces donated by the Hawthorne estate. As they mingled with guests, Thaddeus noticed how warmly people greeted Edith, treating her with a respect that bordered on reverence. During a lull in the conversation, Edith leaned closer to him. This town has seen its share of hardships, but it's also full of hope. People remember kindness, even when they forget grievances. Thaddeus nodded slowly, beginning to understand why she had chosen forgiveness over resentment. It wasn't weakness, it was strength. A quiet determination to rise above the pain and create something better. As the evening drew to a close, Thaddeus found himself standing beside a display case containing items from the Meriwether family. Among them was a locket engraved with the initials EM, likely belonging to Edith's mother. He stared at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. "Do you ever wonder what might have been?" he asked quietly, glancing at Edith. She followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes. But wondering won't change anything. What matters is the life we build moving forward." Her words lingered in his mind long after they returned home, planting seeds of reflection he couldn't ignore. The discovery of the letters had left Thaddeus unsettled, his thoughts a tangled web of guilt and resolve. For days, he wrestled with what to do next. The weight of his family's past pressed heavily on him, but so did Edith's quiet wisdom. Her ability to forgive, not out of weakness, but out of strength, challenged everything he believed about justice and retribution. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the mansion, Thaddeus made a decision. He called a meeting with his attorney, requesting that a trust fund be established in Edith's name. It wasn't just financial support for her or Willow. It was an acknowledgement of the wrongs done to her family, however belatedly. When the paperwork was finalized, he presented it to Edith in the library. "This is unnecessary," she said after reading through the documents, her voice calm but firm. "It's not charity," Thaddeus replied, his tone uncharacteristically earnest. "It's restitution. My grandfather took something from your family, and I want to make it right." Edith studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she set the papers aside and folded her hands in her lap. "You don't owe me anything, Thaddeus. What you're doing now, that's enough." Her words struck him like a hammer blow. Enough? How could any gesture ever be enough to undo decades of pain? Yet there was no anger in her voice, only acceptance. It was as if she understood something he didn't, that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about changing the future. Later that week, Thaddeus accompanied Edith to a doctor's appointment, something he had initially resisted but eventually agreed to after her insistence. The waiting room was sterile and impersonal, filled with the low hum of conversation and the occasional cough. Edith sat quietly, flipping through a magazine while Thaddeus paced restlessly. When her name was called, he followed her into the examination room, earning a raised eyebrow from the nurse. "Family only," she said pointedly. "She's my wife," Thaddeus replied without hesitation, surprising even himself. The doctor, a kind-eyed man named Dr. Patel, reviewed Edith's test results with a mix of professionalism and compassion. "Your condition is stable for now," he explained, "but we need to monitor it closely. Fatigue will likely increase, and mobility may become more challenging." Thaddeus listened intently, his jaw tightening as the reality of Edith's illness sank in. He had known she was sick, of course, but hearing the specifics laid bare made it impossible to ignore. As they left the office, Edith reached for his arm, steadying herself against the cold wind outside. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "It means more than you know." He nodded, unsure how to respond. For all his wealth and power, he felt utterly powerless in the face of her mortality. It was a feeling he hated, but one he couldn't escape. Back at the mansion, Willow noticed a shift in Thaddeus's demeanor. He seemed quieter, more introspective, as if carrying a burden he couldn't put down. One evening, she found him standing on the cliffs overlooking the sea, his silhouette stark against the fading light. "You okay?" she asked, approaching cautiously. He glanced at her, then turned back to the horizon. Do you ever feel like no matter what you do, it's never enough? Willow hesitated, considering the question. Sometimes. But maybe enough isn't the point. Maybe it's about trying anyway, even when it feels hopeless. Her words lingered in the air, simple yet profound. Thaddeus stared at the waves crashing against the rocks below, their rhythm steady and relentless. There was something comforting about their constancy, a reminder that life moved forward regardless of human struggles. The following day, Thaddeus decided to visit Everett, his estranged son, in Boston. Their relationship had been strained for years, marked by misunderstandings and missed opportunities. Thaddeus had always told himself it was Everett's fault. He was too stubborn, too unforgiving. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had failed as a father, prioritizing work over connection, pride over vulnerability. When he arrived at Everett's apartment, the younger man answered the door with visible surprise. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you," Thaddeus admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "We need to talk." Everett hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was modest but welcoming, with books lining the shelves and a guitar resting against the wall. They sat across from each other, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry," Thaddeus began, his throat tight, "for everything. I wasn't the father you deserved, and I can't change that. But I'd like to try to be better if you'll let me." Everett stared at him, his expression guarded. "Why now? After all these years?" "Because I realized I don't have forever," Thaddeus admitted. "And neither do you. I don't want to waste any more time." For a long moment, Everett said nothing. Then he nodded slowly, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "Okay, let's start small." When Thaddeus returned to Seabrook, he felt lighter, as if a piece of the armor he had worn for so long had finally cracked. Edith noticed the change immediately, though she didn't comment on it. Instead, she invited him to join her in the garden, where Willow was painting a new canvas. "What do you think?" Willow asked, stepping back to reveal a vibrant depiction of the cliffs at sunset. "It's beautiful," Thaddeus said honestly, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "You've captured the light perfectly." Willow grinned, clearly pleased by his reaction. "Thanks. Maybe one day you'll sit for a portrait." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't push your luck." As they stood together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Thaddeus felt a rare sense of peace. The road ahead would be difficult. There were still wounds to heal and bridges to rebuild. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face it. The days that followed Thaddeus's visit to Everett marked a subtle but significant shift in the atmosphere of the Hawthorne mansion. Edith noticed it first, how Thaddeus seemed more present, less guarded in his interactions. He began joining her for morning coffee without prompting, asking about her day with genuine curiosity rather than obligation. Willow, too, observed the change, though she kept her thoughts to herself, choosing instead to capture these fleeting moments in her art. One afternoon, as Edith sorted through old photographs in the library, Thaddeus joined her, pulling up a chair without being asked. She glanced at him, surprised by his initiative, but said nothing. Together, they sifted through the images, each one a fragment of Seabrook's history, and, indirectly, their own. "This was taken the year I moved here," Edith said, holding up a faded black and white photo of the town square. "Back then, it was just a handful of shops and a post office." Thaddeus studied the image, tracing the outlines of buildings he now knew well. "It's strange to think how much has changed, and how little." Edith nodded, her gaze distant. "People come and go, but the heart of a place stays the same. It's the stories that matter, the ones we pass down, even when we don't realize it." Her words lingered in the air, resonating with Thaddeus in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He thought of the letters he'd found in the attic, of the lives they represented and the legacy they had left behind. For so long, he had viewed his family's history as a burden, something to be ignored or erased. But now, sitting beside Edith, he began to see it differently, as a tapestry woven from choices both good and bad, each thread contributing to the whole. Later that week, Edith experienced a sudden bout of fatigue, her movements slower and more labored than usual. At first, she tried to brush it off, insisting she was fine. But when she nearly collapsed while walking to the kitchen, Thaddeus intervened, calling Dr. Patel despite her protests. "You're not invincible," he said firmly, helping her to the couch. "Let me take care of you for once." Edith sighed, too tired to argue. "You've already done more than enough." He shook his head, his expression resolute. "Not nearly enough." When Dr. Patel arrived, he conducted a thorough examination, his demeanor calm but concerned. "Her condition is progressing faster than anticipated," he explained afterward, speaking privately with Thaddeus. "She'll need more rest and possibly additional support in the coming weeks." Thaddeus absorbed the news silently, his chest tightening with a mixture of fear and determination. He had always prided himself on control, on solving problems with logic and resources. But this, watching someone he cared about slip away, was beyond his power to fix. That night, as Edith slept, Thaddeus sat by her bedside, watching the rise and fall of her chest. The vulnerability of the moment struck him deeply, forcing him to confront the fragility of life. He thought of all the years he had wasted chasing success, building walls instead of bridges. Now, faced with the inevitability of loss, he realized how hollow those achievements felt without connection. The next morning, Willow approached him in the garden, her expression hesitant. "I overheard what the doctor said." Thaddeus nodded, bracing himself for questions he wasn't sure he could answer. "And I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly, "for being here, for trying. Grandma doesn't say it, but I know she appreciates it." He looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "I'm not doing it for gratitude." "I know," Willow replied, meeting his gaze. "But it means something, to her and to me." Her words stayed with him throughout the day, echoing in his mind like a quiet affirmation. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the impact Edith had made on his life, not just through her kindness, but through her unwavering belief in the possibility of change. Determined to make the most of the time they had left, Thaddeus suggested they revisit some of Edith's favorite places in Seabrook. They started with the library, where she introduced him to the children's section, explaining how she had helped countless kids discover the joy of reading. From there, they visited the farmer's market, where vendors greeted her warmly, offering free samples and heartfelt hugs. At one stall, an elderly man selling handmade quilts recognized Edith and pulled her aside for a private conversation. When she returned, her eyes were bright with emotion. "He remembered my mother," she explained, her voice thick with nostalgia. "They used to trade recipes back when I was a girl." Thaddeus listened intently, realizing how much of Edith's life had been shaped by relationships he had never taken the time to understand. Each story she shared was a reminder of the richness of human connection, a lesson he had spent a lifetime avoiding. As the sun set over the cliffs, casting the ocean in hues of gold and crimson, Edith turned to Thaddeus with a gentle smile. "Thank you for today. It's been a long time since I felt this alive." He swallowed hard, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "You deserve every moment of it." She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her frailty. "Promise me something, Thaddeus. When I'm gone, don't let guilt weigh you down. Use what you've learned to honor the past, yes, but also to build a better future." Her request caught him off guard, forcing him to confront the inevitability of her absence. He nodded, his throat tight. "I promise." The days grew shorter as December approached, the chill in the air sharpening with each passing week. Thaddeus found himself dreading the mornings now, not because of the cold, but because of the growing stillness that seemed to settle over the mansion. Edith's energy waned further, her movements slower and her voice softer. Yet she refused to let her illness dictate her life entirely, insisting on small rituals, reading by the fire, sipping tea in the garden, sharing stories with Willow. One evening, as they sat together in the library, Edith turned to Thaddeus with an unexpected request. "I'd like to host a gathering," she said, her tone light but deliberate. "A celebration of sorts." Thaddeus frowned, unsure what she meant. "A celebration? Of what?" "Of life," she replied simply. "Of the connections we've made, the stories we've shared. It doesn't need to be grand, just something meaningful. He hesitated, his mind racing with objections. The logistics alone felt overwhelming, let alone the emotional weight of such an event. But before he could protest, Edith added, "It's important to me, Thaddeus. Please." Her words left no room for argument. Reluctantly, he agreed, setting aside his reservations to honor her wish. The planning process brought an unexpected sense of purpose to the household. Willow took charge of invitations, reaching out to friends, neighbors, and even some of Edith's former library patrons. Thaddeus focused on the details, arranging seating, coordinating catering, and ensuring the mansion was prepared for guests. Despite his initial reluctance, he found himself investing more effort than he had anticipated, driven by a quiet determination to make the evening special. On the day of the gathering, the mansion transformed into a warm and inviting space. Candles flickered in every room, their soft glow reflecting off polished wood and crystal. Music played softly in the background, a mix of classical pieces and folk tunes chosen by Edith. Outside, strings of lights illuminated the garden, casting a golden hue over the frost-kissed landscape. As guests began to arrive, Edith greeted each one with a smile, her presence radiating warmth despite her frailty. She introduced Thaddeus proudly, referring to him as her husband without hesitation. To his surprise, people responded with genuine affection, their earlier skepticism replaced by respect. For the first time in years, Thaddeus felt like part of something larger than himself, a community bound not by wealth or status, but by shared humanity. Midway through the evening, Edith stood at the center of the room, leaning lightly on her cane. The chatter quieted as she raised a hand, drawing everyone's attention. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice steady despite its softness. "This town has been my home for most of my life, and each of you has played a role in making it so. Whether through kindness, laughter, or simply being present, you've reminded me of what truly matters." She paused, glancing at Thaddeus and Willow before continuing. "Life is fleeting, but love endures. It's the memories we create, the bonds we nurture, that give our days meaning. Tonight, I celebrate not just my own journey, but yours as well, the lives you've touched and the stories you'll leave behind." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with those who heard them. Several guests wiped away tears, while others nodded in quiet agreement. When she finished speaking, the room erupted into applause, heartfelt and sincere. Later that night, after the last guest had departed, Thaddeus found Edith sitting alone in the library, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He joined her silently, pulling up a chair beside hers. "You did it," he said after a moment, his voice low. "You gave them something to remember." Edith smiled faintly, though there was a trace of sadness in her eyes. "No, Thaddeus. We did it. Together." He shook his head, unwilling to accept her generosity. "This was your gift to them, to me. I only followed your lead." She reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Then promise me you'll keep leading, with your heart, not just your head. You have so much to offer, if you'll let yourself." Her words struck him deeply, forcing him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. For all his wealth and influence, he had spent most of his life disconnected. From others, from himself, from the world around him. Edith had shown him another way, one rooted in compassion and connection. And now, faced with her impending absence, he realized how desperately he wanted to hold onto that lesson. "I promise," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "For you." The following morning, Edith remained in bed, too weak to rise. Thaddeus stayed by her side, reading aloud from one of her favorite books, a collection of poetry she had cherished since childhood. Willow joined them later, sketching quietly in the corner as the three of them shared a rare moment of peace. By midday, Edith drifted into a deep sleep, her breathing slow and steady. Thaddeus held her hand, unwilling to let go, while Willow rested her head on his shoulder. Neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary in the face of what they were experiencing. When Edith passed peacefully in the early hours of the next morning, the mansion fell silent, the weight of her absence palpable. Yet amid the grief, there was also gratitude for the time they had shared, the lessons she had taught, and the love she had given so freely. The days following Edith's passing felt heavy, as if the mansion itself had absorbed her absence. Thaddeus moved through the halls like a ghost, his footsteps muffled by the silence that now permeated every room. He avoided the library, unable to face the empty chair where she had spent so many hours reading and knitting. Even the garden seemed different without her, less vibrant, more barren, as though winter had arrived early. Willow, too, struggled with the loss. She spent hours in her studio, painting furiously, but nothing felt right. Her canvases were filled with dark, chaotic strokes, a stark contrast to the bright, hopeful pieces she had created under Edith's influence. When Thaddeus found her one evening, sitting amidst scattered brushes and half-finished works, he hesitated before speaking. "You don't have to keep pushing yourself," he said gently, leaning against the doorway. She glanced up, her eyes red from crying. "I'm not sure what else to do." He entered the room, picking his way carefully through the mess. "You could start by letting yourself grieve. You don't have to have all the answers right now." Willow sighed, setting down her brush. "It's just, she was supposed to see my first gallery show. We talked about it so much. Now it feels like none of it matters." Thaddeus crouched beside her, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "It matters. Maybe not in the way you thought it would, but it does. Your art is part of her legacy now, a piece of her that lives on." His words surprised even him, their sincerity cutting through the numbness he had been feeling. Willow studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right, but it still hurts." "It's supposed to," he admitted. "That's how you know she meant something, to both of us." The funeral was held on a gray, overcast morning, the kind of day that matched the somber mood of those gathered. Friends, neighbors, and former library patrons filled the small chapel, their faces etched with grief and gratitude. Thaddeus stood at the front, alongside Willow, listening as people shared stories about Edith, the kindness she had shown, the wisdom she had imparted, the lives she had touched. When it was his turn to speak, Thaddeus stepped up to the podium, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't planned a speech, unsure of what to say, but as he looked out at the sea of faces, the words came unbidden. "Edith taught me things I didn't think I needed to learn," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "She showed me that strength isn't about power or control. It's about resilience, compassion, and the courage to forgive. She changed me in ways I can't fully explain, and for that, I'll always be grateful." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "She once told me that love endures, that it's the memories we create and the bonds we nurture that give life meaning. I didn't understand it then, but I do now, and I promise to honor her memory by living differently. Not just for myself, but for everyone she cared about." The congregation sat in silence as he returned to his seat, several people wiping away tears. Willow reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly, and for the first time in days, Thaddeus felt a flicker of peace. In the weeks that followed, Thaddeus threw himself into honoring Edith's legacy. He worked with local officials to establish a permanent fund for the Seabrook Public Library, ensuring its continued operation for years to come. The building was renamed the Meriwether Hawthorne Library, a tribute to both Edith and her mother. Willow played an active role in the renovation process, designing murals and selecting artwork to adorn the walls. One afternoon, as they toured the newly renovated space, Willow stopped in front of a large painting she had created, a vibrant depiction of Edith surrounded by books and children. "Do you think she'd like it?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Thaddeus smiled faintly, his gaze softening. "She'd love it, just like she loved you." Willow nodded, blinking back tears. "Thanks for doing this, for making it happen. It's the least I can do," he replied, his tone resolute. "For her, for you." Despite these efforts, Thaddeus couldn't escape the void Edith had left behind. Nights were the hardest, when the mansion felt impossibly empty. He often found himself wandering the halls, drawn to places where her presence still lingered. The kitchen where she had brewed tea, the garden where she had admired the flowers, the library where her favorite books remained untouched. One evening, As he sat alone in the library, he noticed a small envelope tucked between the pages of one of Edith's books. Curious, he opened it, finding a handwritten note inside. To Thaddeus, if you're reading this, it means I've moved on to whatever comes next. Don't mourn me. Celebrate the time we had. You've already given me more than I ever expected. Friendship, respect, and a chance to see the man you're becoming. Keep going, Thaddeus. The world needs more people like you. With love, Edith. Tears blurred his vision as he read the note, the weight of her words sinking in. For so long, he had viewed himself as irredeemable, unworthy of forgiveness or connection. But Edith had seen something in him that he hadn't, potential, a chance to change, to grow, to become someone better. As he folded the note and placed it back in the book, he made a silent vow to live as she had believed he could, with purpose, integrity, and heart. The weeks turned into months, and the sharp edges of grief began to soften, though they never fully disappeared. Thaddeus found himself navigating a new kind of life, one defined not by absence, but by action. He had spent years building walls to keep people out. Now, he was learning how to take them down, brick by brick. His first step was reaching out to Everett again. After their tentative reconciliation in Boston, Thaddeus had promised to start small, but he wasn't sure where to begin. So, he called his son one evening, his voice hesitant as he asked, "How are you?" Everett's response was guarded at first, a polite acknowledgement followed by silence. But over time, their conversations grew more natural. They started meeting for coffee in the city, then dinners at Everett's apartment. Slowly, the distance between them began to shrink. "You've changed," Everett observed during one of their meetings, his tone cautious but curious. Thaddeus nodded, stirring his coffee absently. "I had to. Losing Edith. It made me realize how much I'd been wasting." Everett studied him for a moment, then sighed. "It's not just about her, is it? You're trying to fix things. With me, with everyone." "Maybe," Thaddeus admitted. "But mostly, I'm trying to fix myself." His honesty caught Everett off guard, softening some of the lingering resentment. "Well," he said after a pause, "it's a start." Meanwhile, Willow prepared for her gallery show in New York, pouring all her energy into her work. The pieces she created were raw and emotional, reflecting both her grief and her gratitude for Edith's influence. She titled the collection Echoes, a nod to the lasting impact Edith had on those who knew her. Thaddeus attended the opening night, standing quietly in the corner as guests admired Willow's art. One painting in particular drew his attention, a portrait of Edith seated by the fire, her expression serene yet full of depth. Beneath it, Willow had written a dedication. "For Grandma, who taught me that even the smallest light can guide us through the darkest nights." As he stared at the painting, Thaddeus felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't realized until that moment how much Edith had meant to Willow, not just as a grandmother, but as a mentor and muse. When Willow approached him later, glowing with pride and nerves, he pulled her into an uncharacteristic hug. "You did good," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "She'd be proud." Willow smiled, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Thanks for coming. It means a lot." Back in Seabrook, Thaddeus continued his efforts to honor Edith's legacy. He organized community events at the newly renovated library, inviting local artists, writers, and musicians to share their talents. The space became a hub of creativity and connection, just as Edith had envisioned. Each event reminded him of her quiet determination to make the world a better place, no matter how small the gesture. One afternoon, as he helped set up for a poetry reading, he noticed a familiar face among the volunteers. Lila Marlowe, a woman he had met briefly during Edith's gathering. She was younger than him, with warm brown eyes and a laugh that seemed to brighten any room. They exchanged pleasantries, and when she offered to assist with future events, he accepted without hesitation. Over time, their interactions grew more frequent, their conversations ranging from books to music to shared memories of Edith. Lila had known her through the library, where she had volunteered before moving away for several years. Her stories about Edith's kindness and wit brought a smile to Thaddeus's face, easing the ache of loss. "She always said you had potential," Lila remarked one day. sorting through a stack of donated books. I didn't believe her at first. You seemed so distant. But now I see what she meant. Thaddeus chuckled, shaking his head. Edith saw things in people that no one else did. Sometimes I think she believed in me more than I deserved. Lila paused, studying him thoughtfully. Or maybe she knew you could rise to the occasion. Either way, she left quite the impression on you. Her words lingered in his mind long after their conversation ended, planting seeds of reflection he couldn't ignore. As spring returned to Seabrook, Thaddeus found himself looking forward to the future in a way he hadn't in years. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress. It was becoming a home again, filled with laughter and purpose. He reconnected with old acquaintances, mended strained relationships, and even began mentoring young entrepreneurs in the town, sharing the lessons he had learned, both in business and in life. Yet amid these changes, he carried Edith's memory with him, a quiet reminder of the woman who had changed everything. She had taught him that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about embracing the possibilities of the present. And though he still had much to learn, he was finally ready to try. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Meriwether Hawthorne Library drew a crowd larger than anyone had anticipated. Seabrook residents filled the courtyard, spilling onto the sidewalks as they waited to celebrate the culmination of months of hard work. Thaddeus stood at the front, flanked by Willow and Lila, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The weight of the moment pressed on him, not just the responsibility of honoring Edith's memory, but the realization that this was only the beginning. As the mayor spoke, praising the collaboration between the Hawthorne estate and the community, Thaddeus let his gaze wander over the faces in the crowd. He recognized many of them, patrons who had attended Edith's gatherings, volunteers who had helped renovate the library, even some of the children she had read stories to years ago. Each smile, each nod of gratitude, felt like a thread stitching him into the fabric of Seabrook, a place he had once viewed as merely a backdrop for his wealth. When it was his turn to speak, Thaddeus stepped up to the podium, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling within him. "This library isn't mine," he began, glancing at Willow. "It belongs to all of you. To Edith, whose vision inspired it, and to everyone who believes in the power of stories to connect us." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "Edith taught me that life isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we give. She showed me how to see people not as strangers, but as neighbors. And while I'll never be able to repay her for everything she gave me, I can honor her legacy by continuing to build bridges between families, between generations, between hearts." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, echoing off the library's stone walls. As Thaddeus stepped back, Willow leaned in to whisper, "That was perfect." He shook his head slightly, his expression softening. "No, it wasn't. But it's a start." After the ceremony, guests mingled inside the library, exploring its new features and admiring Willow's murals. Thaddeus found himself drawn to the children's section, where a group of kids sat cross-legged on the floor, listening intently as a volunteer read aloud from one of Edith's favorite books. He lingered in the doorway, watching the scene unfold, and felt a pang of something he hadn't expected: hope. Lila joined him moments later, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you're seeing ghosts," she teased gently, handing him one of the cups. "Maybe I am," he admitted, taking a sip, "but they're good ghosts." She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Edith would have loved this. You know that, right?" Thaddeus nodded, his throat tightening. "Yeah, I do." They stood there in companionable silence, observing the laughter and chatter around them. For the first time in years, Thaddeus didn't feel the need to fill the quiet with words. Instead, he allowed himself to simply exist in the moment, surrounded by the community Edith had cherished so deeply. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thaddeus returned to the cliffs overlooking the sea. It had become a habit of his to visit this spot when he needed clarity or solace. Tonight, however, he wasn't alone. Lila had insisted on joining him, claiming she wanted to see the view for herself. "It's beautiful," she said softly, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool breeze. "Peaceful." Thaddeus nodded, his gaze fixed on the waves crashing against the rocks below. Edith used to come here sometimes. She said it reminded her of how fleeting life is and how precious. Lila glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. Do you think she knew? About how much she'd change you, I mean. He hesitated, considering the question. I don't know. Maybe. She always seemed to understand things before anyone else did. She saw the best in people, Lila added, her tone wistful. Even when they couldn't see it themselves. Thaddeus chuckled dryly, shaking his head. Especially then. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the sound of the ocean filling the silence. Then Lila turned to him, her voice tentative but sincere. You've come a long way, Thaddeus. Not just for Edith, but for yourself. Don't forget that. Her words struck a chord deep within him, forcing him to confront the truth he had been avoiding. He wasn't the same man who had made that reckless bet all those months ago. He had changed, not because he had to, but because he had chosen to. And while the journey wasn't over, he finally felt ready to face whatever came next. In the weeks that followed, Thaddeus continued to embrace the changes in his life. He reconnected with Everett, attending his son's art exhibit in Boston and marveling at the talent he had overlooked for so long. He supported Willow as she prepared for her next gallery show, offering guidance without overstepping. And he grew closer to Lila, finding comfort in her easy laughter and unwavering optimism. One evening, as they strolled through the garden behind the mansion, Lila stopped suddenly, turning to face him. What happens now? She asked, her voice soft but probing. Thaddeus met her gaze, surprised by the question. What do you mean? I mean, where do we go from here? With everything. With us. He hesitated, unsure how to respond. For so long, he had lived in the shadow of his past, letting it dictate his choices and relationships. But now, standing beneath the stars with Lila beside him, he realized he no longer had to carry that burden alone. We keep moving forward, he said finally, his voice firm yet gentle. Together, if you'll have me. Lila smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I'd like that. As they walked back toward the house, hand in hand, Thaddeus felt a sense of peace settle over him. A quiet certainty that Edith's legacy would live on, not just in the library or the stories she had told, but in the lives she had touched. Hers had been a gift of grace, resilience, and love. And though she was gone, her light continued to guide him.